Hello and welcome to Classical Titerature, the show where I had a really lovely intro all typed out, and then my computer died. The last time we checked in on Utopia, we started Book 2, which documents the traditions and practices of the Utopians themselves. This time, we will finish out Book 2 of Utopia, starting with slaves. The Utopians enslave prisoners of war only if they are captured in wars they fight themselves. The children of slaves are not automatically enslaved, nor are any men who were enslaved in a foreign country. Their slaves are either their own former citizens, enslaved for some heinous offense, or else foreigners who were condemned to death in their own land. Most are of the latter sort. Sometimes the Utopians buy them at a very modest rate. More often, they ask for them, get them for nothing, and bring them home in considerable numbers. Both kinds of slaves are kept constantly at work and are always fettered. The Utopians deal with their own people more harshly than with others, feeling that their crimes are worse and deserve stricter punishment because, as it is argued, they had an excellent education and the best of moral training, yet still could not be restrained from wrongdoing. A third class of slaves consists of hard-working, penniless drudges from other nations, who voluntarily choose to become slaves in Utopia. Such people are treated well, almost as well as citizens, except that they are given a little extra work, on the score that they're used to it. If one of them wants to leave, which seldom happens, no obstacles are put in his way, nor is he sent off empty-handed. As I said before, the sick are carefully tended, and nothing in them neglected in the way of medicine or diet which might cure them. Everything is done to mitigate the pain of those who are suffering from incurable diseases, and visitors do their best to console them by sitting and talking with them. But if the disease is not only incurable, but excruciating and continually painful, then the priests and public officials come and urge the invalid not to endure such agony any longer. They remind him that he is now unfit for any of life's duties, a burden to himself and to others. He has really outlived his own death. They tell him he should not let the disease prey on him any longer. But now that life is simply torture and the world a mere prison cell, he should not hesitate to free himself, or to let others free him, from the rack of living. This would be a wise act, they say, since for him death puts an end not only to pleasure but to agony. In addition, he would be obeying the advice of the priests, who are the interpreters of God's will, which ensures that it will be a holy and pious act. Those who have been persuaded by these arguments either starve themselves to death, or take a potion which puts them painlessly to sleep, and frees them from life without any sensation of dying. But they never force this step on a man against his will, nor, if he decides against it, do they lessen their care of him. Under these circumstances, when death is advised by the authorities, they consider all self-destruction honorable. But the suicide, who takes his own life without the approval of priests and senate, they consider unworthy either of earth or fire, and throw his body, unburied and disgraced, into the nearest bog. Women do not marry till they are 18, nor men till they are 22. Premarital intercourse, if discovered and proved, brings severe punishment on both man and woman, and the guilty parties are forbidden to marry during their whole lives, unless the governor by his pardon remits the sentence. In addition, both the father and mother of the household where the offense occurred suffer public disgrace for having been remiss in their duty. The reason they punish this offense so severely is that they suppose few people would join in married love, with confinement to a single partner, and all the petty annoyances that married life involves, unless they were strictly restrained from a life of promiscuity. In choosing marriage partners, they solemnly and seriously follow a custom which seemed to us foolish and absurd in the extreme. Whether she is a widow or a virgin, the bride-to-be is shown naked to the groom by a responsible and respectable matron, and, similarly, some respectable man presents the groom naked to his future bride. We laughed at this custom and called it absurd, but they were just as amazed at the folly of all other peoples. When men go to buy a colt, where they are risking only a little money, they are so suspicious that though the beast is almost bare, they won't close the deal until the saddle and blanket have been taken off, lest there be a hidden sore underneath. Yet, in the choice of a mate, which may cause either delight or disgust for the rest of their lives, people are completely careless. They leave all the rest of her body covered up with clothes, and estimate the attractiveness of a woman from a mere hand's breadth of her person, the face, which is all they can see. And so they marry, running great risk of hating one another for the rest of their lives, if something in either person should offend the other. Not all people are so wise as to concern themselves solely with character, and even the wise appreciate physical beauty as a supplement to the virtues of the mind. There's no question but that deformity may lurk under clothing, serious enough to make a man hate his wife when it's too late to be separated from her. When deformities are discovered after marriage, each person must bear his own fate, so the Utopians think everyone should be protected by law beforehand. There is extra reason for them to be careful, because in that part of the world they are the only people who practice monogamy. Their marriages are seldom terminated except by death, though they do allow divorce for adultery or for intolerably difficult behavior. A husband or wife who is the aggrieved party in such a divorce is granted permission by the Senate to remarry, but the guilty party is considered disreputable and permanently forbidden to take another mate. They absolutely forbid a husband to put away his wife against her will because of some bodily misfortune. They think it cruel that a person should be abandoned when most in need of comfort, and they add that old age, since it not only entails disease, but is actually a disease itself, needs more than a precarious fidelity. It happens occasionally that a married couple cannot get along, and have both found other persons with whom they hope to live more harmoniously. After getting the approval of the Senate, they may then separate by mutual consent and contract new marriages. But such divorces are only allowed after the senators and their wives have carefully investigated the case. They allow divorce only very reluctantly, because they know that husbands and wives will find it hard to settle down together if each has in mind that a new marriage is easily available. They punish adulterers with the strictest form of slavery. If both parties were married, they are both divorced, and the injured parties may marry one another, if they want, or someone else. But if one of the injured parties continues to love such an undeserving spouse, the marriage may go on, providing the innocent person chooses to share in the labor to which every slave is condemned. And sometimes it happens that the repentance of the guilty and the devotion of the innocent party move the governor to pity, so that he restores both to freedom. But a second conviction of adultery is punished by death. No other crimes carry fixed penalties. The Senate sets specific penalties for each particular misdeed, as it is considered atrocious or venial. Husbands chastise their wives, and parents their children, unless the offense is so serious that public punishment seems to be in the public interest. Generally, the gravest crimes are punished by slavery, for they think this deters offenders just as much as instant capital punishment, and is more beneficial to the Commonwealth. Slaves, moreover, are permanent and visible reminders that crime does not pay. If the slaves rebel against their condition, then, like savage beasts, which neither bars nor chains can tame, they are finally put to death. But if they are patient, they are not left altogether without hope. When subdued by long hardships, if they show by their behavior that they regret the crime more than the punishment, their slavery is lightened or remitted altogether, sometimes by the governor's pardon, sometimes by popular vote. A man who tries to seduce a woman is subject to the same penalties as if he had actually done it. They think that a crime attempted is as bad as one committed, and that failure should not confer advantages on a criminal who did all he could to succeed. They are very fond of fools, and think it contemptible to insult them. There is no prohibition against enjoying their foolishness, and they even regard this as beneficial to the fools. If anyone is so serious and solemn that the foolish behavior and comic patter of a clown do not amuse him, they do not entrust him with the care of such a person. for fear that a man who gets no fun from a fool's only gift will not treat him kindly. To mock a person for being deformed or crippled is considered disgraceful, not to the victim, but to the mocker, who stupidly reproaches the cripple for something he cannot help. They think it is a sign of a weak and sluggish character to neglect one's natural beauty, but they consider cosmetics a detestable affectation. From experience, they have learned that no physical beauty recommends a wife to her husband so effectually as truthfulness and integrity. Though quite a few men are captured by beauty alone, none are held except by virtue and compliance. As they deter people from crimes by penalties, so they incite them to virtue by public honors. They set up in the marketplace statues of the distinguished men who have served their country well, thinking thereby to preserve the memory of their good deeds and to spur on the citizens to emulate the glory of their ancestors. Any man who campaigns for a public office is disqualified for all of them. They live together harmoniously, and the public officials are never arrogant or unapproachable. Instead, they are called fathers, and that is the way they behave. Because the officials never extort respect from the people against their will, the people respect them spontaneously, as they should. Not even the governor is distinguished from his fellow citizens by a robe or crown. He is known only by a sheaf of grain carried before him, just as the high priest is distinguished by a wax candle. They have very few laws, and their training is such that they need no more. The chief fault they find with other nations is that, even with infinite volumes of laws and interpretations, they cannot manage their affairs properly. They think it completely unjust to bind people by a set of laws that are too many to be read and too obscure for anyone to understand. As for lawyers, a class of men whose trade it is to manipulate cases and multiply quibbles, they have no use for them at all. They think it better for each man to plead his own case, and say the same to the judge that he would tell his lawyer. This makes for less ambiguity, and readier access to the truth. A man speaks his mind without tricky instructions from a lawyer, and the judge examines each point carefully, taking pains to protect simple folk against the false accusations of the crafty. It is hard to find this kind of plain dealing in other countries, where they have such a multitude of incomprehensibly intricate laws. But in Utopia, everyone is a legal expert. For the laws are very few, as I said, and they consider the most obvious interpretation of any law to be the fairest. As they see things, all laws are promulgated for the single purpose of teaching every man his duty. Subtle interpretations teach very few, since hardly anyone is able to interpret them, whereas the more simple and apparent sense of the law is open to everyone. If laws are not clear, they are useless. For simple-minded men, and most men are of this sort and need to be told where their duty lies, there might as well be no laws at all, as laws which can be interpreted only by devious minds after endless disputes. The average common man cannot understand this legal chicanery, and couldn't even if he studied it his whole life, since he has to earn a living in the meantime. Some time ago, the Utopians helped various of their neighbors to throw off the yoke of tyranny, and since then, these people, who have learned to admire Utopian virtue, have made a practice of asking for Utopians to rule over them. Some of these rulers serve 1 year, others 5. When their service is over, they return with honor and praise to their home, and others are sent in their place. These countries seem to have settled on an excellent scheme to safeguard their happiness and safety. Since the welfare or ruin of a commonwealth depends wholly on the character of the officials, where could they make a more prudent choice than among Utopians, who cannot be tempted by money? For money is useless to them when they go home, as they soon must, and they can have no partisan or factional feelings, since they are strangers to the affairs of the city over which they rule. Wherever they take root in men's minds, these two evils, greed and faction, are the destruction of all justice, and justice is the strongest bond of any society. The Utopians call these people, who have borrowed magistrates from them, their allies. Others, whom they have benefited, they simply call friends. While other nations are constantly making treaties, breaking them, and renewing them, The Utopians never make any treaties at all. If nature, they say, doesn't bind man adequately to his fellow man, what will an alliance do? If a man scorns nature herself, is there any reason to think he will care about mere words? They are confirmed in this view by the fact that in that part of the world, treaties and alliances between kings are generally not observed with much good faith. In Europe, of course, the dignity of treaties is everywhere kept sacred and inviolable, especially in these regions where the Christian religion prevails. This is partly because the kings are all so just and virtuous, partly also because of the reverence and fear that everyone feels towards the ruling popes. Just as the popes themselves never promise anything which they do not consciously perform, they command all other princes to abide by their promises in every way. If someone quibbles over it, they compel him to obey by means of pastoral censure and sharp reproof. The popes rightfully declare that it would be particularly disgraceful if people who are specifically called the faithful did not adhere faithfully to their solemn word. But in that new world, which is scarcely removed from ours by geography so far as it is by customs and manners, nobody trusts treaties. The greater the formalities, the more numerous and solemn the oaths, the sooner the treaties will be broken. The rulers will easily find some defect in the wording of it, which often enough they deliberately inserted themselves. No treaty can be made so strong and explicit that a government will not be able to worm out of it, breaking in the process both the treaty and its own word. If such craft, deceit, and fraud were practiced in private contracts, the politicians would raise a great outcry against both parties, calling them sacrilegious and worthy of the gallows. Yet the very same politicians think themselves clever fellows when they give this sort of advice to kings. As a consequence, people are apt to think that justice is a humble, plebeian virtue, far beneath the majesty of kings. Or else they conclude that there are two kinds of justice, one which is only for the common herd, a lowly justice that creeps along the ground, encumbered with chains, and the other, which is the justice of princes, much more free and majestic, so that it can do anything it wants and nothing it doesn't want. This royal practice of keeping treaties badly is, I suppose, the reason that the Utopians don't make any. Doubtless, if they lived here in Europe, they would all change their minds. However, they think it is bad to make treaties at all, even if they are faithfully observed. A treaty implies that people who are separated by some natural obstacle as slight as a hill or a brook are joined by no bond of nature. It assumes that they are born rivals and enemies, and are right in aiming to destroy one another, except in so far as the treaty restrains them. Moreover, they see that treaties do not really promote friendship, for both parties still retain the right to prey upon one another, unless extreme care has been used in drawing up the treaty to outlaw freebooting. The Utopians think, on the other hand, that no one should be considered an enemy who has done you no harm, that the fellowship of nature is as good as a treaty, and that men are united more firmly by good will than by pacts, by their hearts than by their words. Military practices. They despise war as an activity fit only for beasts, yet practiced more by man than by any other creature. Unlike almost every other people in the world, they think nothing so inglorious as the glory won in battle. Yet on certain fixed days, men and women alike carry on vigorous military training, so they will be fit to fight should the need arise. But they go to war only for good reasons. Among these are the protection of their own lands, the protection of their friends from an invading army, and the liberation of an oppressed people from tyranny and servitude. Out of human sympathy, they not only protect their friends from present danger, but avenge previous injuries. They do this, however, only if they themselves have previously been consulted, have approved the cause, and have demanded restitution in vain. Then and only then they think themselves free to declare war. They take this final step not only when their friends have been plundered, but also when their friends' merchants have been subjected to extortion in another country, either through laws unfair in themselves, or through the perversion of good laws. This and no other was the cause of the war which the Utopians waged a little before our time on behalf of the Nephelagites against the Allopolitans. Under pretext of right, a wrong, as they saw it, had been inflicted on some Neophelagate traders residing among the Allopolitans. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the quarrel, it developed into a fierce war, into which, apart from the hostile forces of the two parties themselves, the neighboring nations poured all their resources. Some prosperous nations were ruined completely, others badly shaken. One trouble led to another, and in the end the Allopolitans were crushed and reduced to slavery, since the Utopians weren't involved on their own account, by the Neophelagites, a people who, before the war, had not been remotely comparable in power to their rivals. So severely do the Utopians punish wrong done to their friends, even in matters of mere money. But they are not so strict in standing up for their own rights. When they are cheated in any way, so long as no bodily harm is done, their anger goes no further than cutting off trade relations with that nation till restitution is made. The reason is not that they care more for their allies' citizens than for their own, but simply this. When the merchants of allies are cheated, it is their own property that is lost. But when the Utopians lose something, it comes from the common stock, and is bound to be in plentiful supply at home. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been exporting it. Hence, no one individual has to stand the loss. So small a loss, which affects neither the life nor the livelihood of any of their own people, they consider it cruel to avenge by the death of many soldiers. On the other hand, if one of their own is killed or maimed anywhere, whether by a government or by a private citizen, they first send envoys to look into the circumstances. Then they demand that the guilty persons be surrendered, and if that demand is refused, they are not to be put off, but at once declare war. If the guilty persons are surrendered, their punishment is death or slavery. The Utopians are not only troubled, but ashamed when their forces gain a bloody victory, thinking it folly to pay too high a price even for the best goods. But if they overcome the enemy by skill and cunning, they exult mightily, celebrate a public triumph, and raise a monument as for a mighty exploit. They think they have really acted with manly virtue, when they have won a victory such as no animal except man could have won. A victory achieved by beasts fight with their bodies. Bears, lions, boars, wolves, dogs, and other wild beasts fight with their bodies, they say, and most of them are superior to us in strength and ferocity. But we outdo them all in shrewdness and rationality. The only thing they aim at, in going to war, is to secure what would have prevented the declaration of war, if the enemy had conceded it beforehand. Or, if they cannot get that, they try to take such bitter revenge on those who have injured them, that they will be afraid to ever do it again. These are their chief concerns, which they go after energetically, yet in such a way as to avoid danger rather than to win fame and glory. As soon as war is declared, therefore, they have their secret agents set up overnight many placards, each marked with their official seal, in the most conspicuous places throughout the enemy territory. In these proclamations, they promise immense rewards to anyone who will kill the enemy's king. They offer smaller but still very substantial sums for killing any of a list of other individuals whom they name. These are the persons who they regard as most responsible, after the king, for plotting aggression against them. The reward for an assassin is doubled for anyone who succeeds in bringing in one of the prescribed men alive. The same reward, plus a guarantee of personal safety, is offered to any one of the prescribed men who turns against his comrades. As a result, the enemies of the Utopians quickly come to suspect everyone, particularly one another, and the many perils of their situation lead to panic. They know perfectly well that many of them, including their princes as well, have been betrayed by those in whom they placed complete trust. So effective are bribes as an incentive to crime. Knowing this, the Utopians are lavish in their promises of bounty. Being well aware of the risks their agents must run, they make sure that the payments are in proportion to the peril. Thus, they not only offer, but actually deliver, enormous sums of gold, as well as large landed estates in very secure locations on the territory of their friends. Everywhere else in the world, this process of bidding for and buying the life of an enemy is condemned as the cruel villainy of a degenerate mind. But the Utopians consider it good policy, both wise and merciful. In the first place, it enables them to win tremendous wars without fighting any actual battles. And in the second place, it enables them, by the sacrifice of a few guilty men, to spare the lives of many innocent persons who would have died in battle, some on their side, some on the enemy's. They pity the mass of enemy's soldiers almost as much as their own citizens, for they know common people do not go to war of their own accord, but are driven to it by the madness of princes. If an assassination does not work, they sow the seeds of dissension in enemy ranks by inciting the prince's brother or some other member of the nobility to scheme for the crown. If internal discord dies down, they try to rouse up the neighboring peoples against the enemy by reviving forgotten claims to dominion, of which kings always have an ample supply. When they promise their resources to help in a war, they send money very freely, but commit their own citizens only sparingly. They hold their own people dear, and value them so highly that they would not exchange one of their citizens for an enemy's prince. Since they keep their gold and silver for the purpose of war alone, they spend it without hesitation. After all, they will continue to live just as well, even if they expend the whole sum. Besides the wealth they have at home, they have a vast treasure abroad, since, as I said before, many nations owe them money. So they hire mercenary soldiers from all sides, especially the Zapolits. These people live 500 miles to the east of Utopia, and are rude, rough, and fierce. The forests and mountains where they are bred are the kind of country they like, tough and rugged. They are a hard race, capable of standing heat, cold, and drudgery, unacquainted with any luxuries, careless of what houses they live in, or what they wear. They do not till the fields, but raise cattle instead. Most of them survive by hunting and stealing. These people are born for battle, and are always eager for a fight. They seek one out at every opportunity. Leaving their own country in great numbers, they offer themselves for cheap hire to anyone in need of warriors. The only art they know for earning a living is the art of taking life. They fight with great courage and incorruptible loyalty for the people who pay them, but they will not bind themselves to serve for any fixed period of time. If someone, even the enemy, offers them more money tomorrow, they will take his side, and the day after tomorrow, if a trifle more is offered to bring them back, they'll return to their first employers. Hardly a war is fought in which a good number of them are not engaged in both sides. It happens every day that men who are united by ties of blood and served together in intimacy through long campaigns, but who are now separated into opposing armies, meet in battle. Forgetful of kinship and comradeship alike, they furiously run one another through, with no motive than that they were hired for paltry pay by opposing princes. They care so much about money that they can easily be induced to change sides for an increase of only a penny a day. They have picked up the habit of avarice, but none of the profit. For what they earn by shedding blood, they quickly squander on debauchery of the most squalid sort. Because the Utopians give higher pay than anyone else, these people are ready to serve them against any enemy whatever. And the Utopians who seek out the best possible men for proper uses, hire these, the worst possible men, for improper uses. When the situation requires, they thrust the Zapolits into the positions of greatest danger by offering them immense rewards. Most of them never come back to collect their pay, but the Utopians faithfully pay off those who do survive, to encourage them to try it again. As for how many Zapolits get killed, the Utopians never worry about that, for they think they would deserve very well of all mankind if they could exterminate from the face of the earth that entire disgusting and vicious race. Besides the Zapolits, they employ as auxiliaries the soldiers of the people for whom they have taken up arms, and then squadrons of all their other friends. Last, they add their own citizens, including some man of known bravery to command the entire army. In addition, they appoint 2 substitutes for him, who hold no rank as long as he is safe. But if the commander is captured or killed, the first of these 2 substitutes becomes his successor, and in case of a mishap to him, the other. Thus, though the accidents of war cannot be foreseen, they make sure that the whole army will not be disorganized through the loss of their leader. Only volunteers are sent to fight abroad. They are picked from men within each city. No one is forced to fight abroad against his will, because they think a man who is naturally a bit fearful will act weakly at best, and may even spread panic among his comrades. But if their own country is invaded, they call everyone to arms, posting the fearful, as long as they are physically fit, on shipboard among braver men, or here and there along fortifications, where there is no place to run away. Thus, shame at failing their countrymen, desperation at the immediate presence of the enemy, and the impossibility of flight often combine to overcome their fear, and they turn brave out of sheer necessity. Just as no man is forced into a foreign war against his will, so women are allowed to accompany their men on military service if they want to. Not only not forbidden, but encouraged and praised for doing so. They place each woman alongside her husband in the line of battle, and in addition they place around him all of a man's children, kinsmen, and blood, or marriage relations, so that those who by nature have most reason to help one another may be closest at hand for mutual aid. It is as a matter of great reproach for either partner to come home without the other, or a son to return after losing his father. The result is, for that as long as the enemy stands his ground, the hand-to-hand fighting is apt to be long and bitter, ending only when everyone is dead. As I observed, they take every precaution to avoid fighting in person, so long as they can bring the war to an end with mercenaries. But, when they are forced to take part in battle, they are as bold in the struggle as they were formerly prudent in avoiding it while they could. In the first charge they are not fierce, but gradually as the fighting goes on they grow more determined, putting up a steady, stubborn resistance. Their spirit is so strong that they will die rather than yield ground. They have no anxieties about making a living at home, nor any worry about the future of their families, and that sort of worry often daunts the boldest courage. So their spirit is exalted and unconquerable. Knowing the job of warfare, and knowing it well, gives them extra confidence. Also from childhood, they have been trained by example and instruction in the first principles of patriotism, and that too adds to their courage. They do not hold life so cheap that they throw it away recklessly, nor so dear as to grasp it avidly at the price of shame, when duty bids them to give it up. At the height of the battle, a band of the bravest young men, who have taken a special oath, devote themselves to seeking out the opposing general. They attack him directly. They lay secret traps for him. They hit at him from near and far. A continuous supply of fresh men keep up the assault as the exhausted drop out. In the end, they rarely fail to kill or capture him, unless he takes to flight. When they win a battle, it never ends in a massacre, for they would much rather take prisoners than cut throats. They never pursue fugitives without keeping one line of their army drawn up under the colors and ready to renew the fight. They are so careful of this that if they win the victory with this last reserve force, supposing the rest of their army has been beaten, they would rather let the enemy army escape than be tricked into pursuing fugitives with their own ranks in disorder. They remembered what had happened more than once to themselves, that when the enemy seemed to have the best of the day, had routed the main Utopian force and scattered to pursue the fugitives, a few Utopians held in reserve, and watching their opportunity, have suddenly attacked the dispersed enemy at the very moment when he felt safe and had lowered his guard. Thereby they changed the fortune of the day, snatched a certain victory out of the enemy's hands, and, though conquered themselves, were able to overcome their conquerors. It is not easy to say whether they are more crafty in laying ambushes or more cautious in avoiding those laid for them. Sometimes they seem to be on the point of breaking and running, when that is the very last thing they have in mind. but when they really are ready to retreat, you would never guess it. If they are too few to attack, or the terrain is unsuitable, they shift their ground silently by night and slip away from the enemy by some stratagem. Or if they have to withdraw by day, they do so gradually, and in such good order that they are as dangerous to attack then as if they were advancing. They fortify their camps very carefully with a deep, broad ditch all around them, the earth being thrown inward to make a wall. The work is not done by workmen, but by the soldiers themselves with their own hands. The whole army pitches in, except for a guard which is posted around the workers to prevent a surprise attack. With so many hands at work, they complete great fortifications, enclosing wide areas with unbelievable speed. The armor they wear is strong enough to protect them from blows, but does not prevent easy movement of the body. In fact, it doesn't interfere even with their swimming, and part of their military training consists of swimming in armor. For long-range fightings they use arrows, which they fire with great strength and accuracy, and from horseback as well as on the ground. At close quarters, they use not swords but battle-axes, which, because of their sharp edge and great weight, are lethal weapons, whether used in slashing or thrusting. They are very skillful in inventing machines of war, but conceal them with the greatest care, since if they were made known before they were needed, the enemy might turn them to ridicule and lessen their effect. Their first consideration in designing them is to make them easy to carry and aim. When the Utopians make a truce with the enemy, they observe it religiously, and will not break it even if provoked. They do not ravage the enemy's territory or burn his crops. Indeed, so far as possible, they avoid any trampling of the crops by men or horses, thinking they may need the grain themselves later on. Unless he is a spy, they injure no unarmed man. When cities are surrendered to them, they keep them intact. Even when they have stormed a place, they do not plunder it, but put to death the men who prevented surrender, enslave the other defenders, and do no harm to the civilians. If they find any of the inhabitants who recommended surrender, they give them a share in the property of the condemned, and present their auxiliaries with the rest, for the Utopians themselves never take any booty. After a war is ended, they collect the cost of it, not from the allies for whose sake they undertook it, but from the conquered. They take as indemnity not only money, which they set aside to finance future wars, but also landed estates, from which they may enjoy forever a generous annual income. They now have property of this sort in many different countries, which over the years has increased little by little, and has been augmented in various ways, till it now amounts to over 700,000 ducats a year. As managers of these estates, they send abroad some of their own citizens to serve as collectors of revenue. Though they live on the properties in great style and conduct themselves like great personages, plenty of income is still left over to be put in the public treasury, unless they choose to give the conquered nation credit. They often do the latter, unless they happen to need the money, and even then it's rare for them to call in the entire debt. And of course some of the estates are given, as I've already described, to those who have risked great dangers in their behalf. If any princes take up arms and prepares to invade their land, they immediately attack him in full force outside their own borders. They are most reluctant to wage war on their own soil, and no necessity could ever compel them to admit foreign auxiliaries onto their island. The Religions of the Utopians. There are different forms of religion throughout the island, and in each particular city as well. Some worship as a god the sun, others the moon, and still others one of the planets. There are some who worship a man of past ages who was conspicuous either for virtue or glory. They consider him not only a god, but the supreme god. Most of the Utopians, however, and among these all the wisest, believe nothing of the sort. They believe in a single power, unknown, eternal, infinite, inexplicable, far beyond the grasp of the human mind, and diffused throughout the universe, not physically, but in influence. They call him Father, and to him alone they attribute the origin, increase, progress, change, and end of all visible things. They do not offer divine honors to any other. Though the other sects of the Utopians differ from this main group in various particular doctrines, they all agree in this single head, that there is one supreme power, the maker and ruler of the universe, whom they all call in their native language Mithra. Different people define him differently, and each supposes the object of his worship is the special vessel of that great force which all people agree in worshipping. But gradually they are coming to forsake this mixture of superstitions, and to unite in that one religion which seems more reasonable than any of the others. And there is no doubt that the other religions would have disappeared long ago, except for various unlucky accidents that befell certain Utopians who were thinking about changing their religion. All the others immediately construed these events as a sign of heavenly anger, not chance, as if the deity who was being abandoned were avenging an insult against himself. But after they had heard from us the name of Christ, and learned of his teachings, his life, his miracles, and the no less marvelous devotion of the many martyrs who shed their blood to draw nations far and near into the Christian fellowship, you would not believe how they were impressed. Either through the mysterious inspiration of God, or because Christianity is very like the religion already prevailing among them, they were well disposed towards it from the start. But I think they were also much influenced by the fact that Christ had encouraged his disciples to practice community of goods, and that among the truest groups of Christians the practice still prevails. Whatever the reason, no small number of them choose to join our communion, and received the holy water of baptism. By that time 2 of our group had died, and among us 4 survivors there was, I am sorry to say, no priest. So though they received instruction in other matters, they still lack those sacraments which in our religion can be administered only by priests. They do, however, understand what they are, and earnestly desire them. In fact, they dispute vigorously whether a man chosen from amongst themselves could legitimately assume the functions of a priest without the dispatch of a Christian bishop. Though they seemed on the point of selecting such a person, they had not yet done so when I left. Those who have not accepted Christianity make no effort to restrain others from it, nor do they criticize new converts to it. While I was there, only one of the Christians got into trouble with the law. As soon as he was baptized, he took upon himself to preach the Christian religion publicly, with more zeal than discretion. We warned him not to do so, but he soon worked himself up to a pitch where he not only set our religion above the rest, but condemned all others as profane in themselves, leading their impious and sacrilegious followers to the hell flames they richly deserved. After he had been going on in this style for a long time, they arrested him. He was tried on a charge, not of despising their religion, but of creating a public disorder, convicted, and sentenced to exile. For it is one of their oldest institutions that no man's religion, as such, shall be held against him. Even before he came to the island, Utopus had heard that the inhabitants were continually quarreling over religious matters. In fact, he found it was easy to conquer the country because the different sects were too busy fighting one another to oppose him. As soon as he had gained the victory, therefore, he decreed that everyone may cultivate the religion of his choice, and strenuously proselytize for it too, provided he does so quietly, modestly, rationally, and without bitterness towards others. If persuasion fails, no one is allowed to resort to abuse or violence, under penalty of exile or enslavement. Utopus laid down these rules not simply for the sake of peace, which he saw was in danger of being destroyed by constant quarrels and implacable hatreds, but also for the sake of religion itself. In matters of religion, he was not at all quick to dogmatize, because he suspected that God perhaps likes diverse and manifold forms of worship, and has therefore deliberately inspired different people with different views. On the other hand, he was quite sure that it was arrogant folly for anyone to enforce conformity with his own beliefs by means of threats or violence. He supposed that if one religion is true and the rest false, the true one will sooner or later prevail by its own natural strength, provided only that men consider the matter reasonably and moderately. But if they try to decide these matters by fighting and rioting, since the worst men are always the most headstrong, the best and holiest religion in the world will be crowded out by blind superstitions, like grain choked out of a field by thorn and briars. So he left the whole matter open, allowing each individual to choose what he would believe. The only exception he made was a positive and strict law against any person who should sink so far below the dignity of human nature as to think that the soul perishes with the body, or that the universe is ruled by mere chance rather than divine providence. Thus the Utopians all believe that after this life vices are to be punished and virtue rewarded. And they consider that anyone who opposes this proposition is not even one of the human race, since he has degraded in the sublimity of his own soul to the base level of a beast's wretched body. Still less will then count him as one of their citizens, since he would undoubtedly betray all the laws and customs of society if not prevented by fear. Who can doubt that a man who has nothing to fear but the law, and no hope of life beyond the grave, will do anything he can to evade his country's law by craft or break them by violence, in order to gratify his own private greed? Therefore, a person who holds such views is offered no honors, entrusted with no offices, and given no public responsibility. He is universally regarded as a low and sordid fellow. Yet they do not afflict him with punishments, because they are persuaded that no one can choose to believe by a mere act of the will. They do not compel him by threats to dissemble his views, nor do they tolerate in the matter any deceit, nor argue with the common people in behalf of his opinion. They do not compel him by threats to dissemble his views, nor do they tolerate in the matter any deceit or lying, which they detest as next door to deliberate malice. The man may not argue with the common people in behalf of his opinion, but in the presence of the priests and other important persons, they not only permit but encourage it, for they are confident that in the end his madness will yield to reason. There are some others, in fact no small number of them, who err in the opposite direction, in supposing that animals too have immortal souls, though not comparable to ours in excellence, nor destined to equal felicity. These people are not thought to be evil, their opinion is not thought to be wholly unreasonable, and so they are not interfered with. Almost all the Utopians are absolutely convinced that human bliss after death will be enormous and eternal. Thus they lament every individual sickness, but mourn over a death only if they see that a person was torn from life despairingly or unwillingly. Almost all the Utopians are convinced that human bliss after death will be enormous and eternal. Thus they lament every individual sickness, but mourn over a death only if they see that a person was torn from life despairingly and unwillingly. Such behavior they take to be a very bad sign, as if the soul, being in anguish and conscious of guilt, dreaded the death through a secret premonition of punishments to come. Besides, they suppose God can hardly be well pleased with the coming of one who, when he is summoned, does not gladly come, but is dragged off reluctantly and against his will. Such a death fills the onlookers with horror, and they carry away the corpse to the cemetery in melancholy silence. There, after begging God to have mercy on his spirit and to pardon his infirmities, they commit his body to the earth. But when a man dies blithely and full of good hope, they do not mourn for him, but carry his body cheerfully away, singing and commending the dead man's soul to God. They cremate him in a spirit more of reverence than of grief, and erect a tombstone on which the dead man's honors are inscribed. As they go home, they talk of his character and deeds, and no part of his life is mentioned more frequently or gladly than his joyful death. They think that recollecting the dead person's good qualities helps the living to behave virtuously, and is also the most acceptable form of honor to the dead. For they think that dead people are actually present among us, and hear what we say about them, though through the dullness of human sight they are invisible to our eyes. Given their state of bliss, the dead must be able to travel freely where they please, and they are bound to want to revisit their friends, whom they loved and honored during their lives. Like all other good deeds, they think that after death charity is increased rather than decreased in all good men, and thus they believe the dead come frequently among the living, to observe their words and actions. Hence they go about their business the more confidently because of their trust in such protectors, and the belief that their forefathers are physically present keeps them from any secret dishonorable deed. Fortune-telling and other vain forms of superstitious divination, such as other peoples take very seriously, they consider ridiculous and contemptible. But they venerate miracles which occur without the help of nature, considering them direct and visible manifestations of the divine power. Indeed, they report that miracles have frequently occurred in their country. Sometimes, in great and dangerous crises, they pray publicly for a miracle, which they then anticipate with great confidence, and obtain. They think that the careful contemplation of nature, and the sense of reverence arising from it, are acts of worship to God. There are some people, however, and quite a few of them, who for religious motives reject learning, pursue no studies, and refuse all leisure, but devote their full time to good works. Constant dedication to the offices of charity, these people think, will increase their chances of happiness after death, and so they are always busy. Some tend to the sick, others repair roads, clean ditches, rebuild bridges, dig turf, gravel, or stones, fell trees and cut them up, and transport wood, grain, and other commodities into the cities by wagon. They work for private citizens as well as the public, and work even harder than slaves. They undertake with cheery good will any task that is so rough, hard, and dirty that most people refuse to tackle it because of the toil, boredom, and frustration involved. While constantly engaged in heavy labor themselves, they secure leisure for others, and yet they claim no credit for it. They do not criticize the way other people live, nor do they boast of their own doings. The more they put themselves in the position of slaves, the more highly they are honored by everyone. These people are of two sects. The first are celibates, who abstain not only from sex, but also from eating meat, and some of them from any sort of animal food whatsoever. They reject all the pleasures of this life as harmful, and look forward only to the joys of the life to come, which they hope to deserve by hard labor and all-night vigils. As they hope to attain it quickly, they are cheerful and active in the here and now. The other kind is just as fond of hard work, but prefer to marry. They do not despise the comforts of marriage, but think that, as their duty to nature requires work, so their duty to their country requires them to beget children. They avoid no pleasure, unless it interferes with their labor, and gladly eat meat, precisely because they think it makes them stronger for any sort of heavy work. The Utopians regard the second sort as more sensible, but the first sort as holier. If anyone claimed to prefer celibacy to marriage, and a hard life to a comfortable one, on grounds of reason alone, the Utopians would think him absurd. But since these men claim to be motivated by religion, the Utopians respect and revere them. There is no subject on which they are warier of jumping to conclusions than this matter of religion. These, then, are the men whom in their own language they call Buthrescas, a term which may be translated as the religious. Their priests are of great holiness, and therefore very few. In each city there are no more than 13, one for each church. In case of war, 7 of them go out with the army, and 7 substitutes are appointed to fill their places for the time being. When the regular priests come back, the substitutes return to their former posts, that is, they serve as assistants to the high priest, until one of the regular 13 dies, and then one of them succeeds to his position. The high priest is, of course, in authority over all the others. Priests are elected, just like all other officials, by secret popular vote, in order to avoid partisan feeling. After election, they are ordained by the College of Priests. Their chief functions are to preside over divine worship, decree religious rites, and act as censors of public morality. For a man to be summoned before them and scolded for not living an honorable life is considered a great disgrace. As the duty of the priest is simply to counsel and advise, so correcting and punishing the offenders is the duty of the governor and the other officials, though the priests may and do exclude from divine services persons whom they find to be extraordinarily wicked. Hardly any punishment is more dreaded than this. The excommunicate incurs great disgrace and is tortured by the fear of damnation. Not even his body is safe for long, for unless he quickly convinces the priests of his repentance, he will be seized and punished by the Senate for impiety. The priests are entrusted with teaching the children and young people. Instruction in good manners and pure morals is considered just as important as the accumulation of learning. From the very first, they try to instill in the pupils' minds, while they are still young and tender, principles which will be useful to preserve the commonwealth. What is planted in the minds of children lives on in the minds of adults, and is of great value in strengthening the commonwealth. The decline of society can always be traced to vices which arise from wrong attitudes. Women are not debarred from the priesthood, but only a widow of advanced years is ever chosen, and it doesn't happen often. The wives of male priests are the very finest women in the whole country. No official in Utopia is more honored than the priest. Even if one of them commits a crime, he is not brought into a court of law, but left to God and his own conscience. They think it wrong to lay human hands on a man, however guilty, who has been specially consecrated to God as a holy offering, so to speak. This custom is the easier for them to observe because their priests are very few and very carefully chosen. Besides, it rarely happens that a man selected for his goodness and raised to high dignity wholly because of his moral character will fall into corruption and vice. If such a thing should happen, human nature being as changeable as it is, no great harm is to be feared, because the priests are so few and have no power beyond that which derives from their good reputation. In fact, the reason for having so few priests is to prevent the order, which the Utopians now esteem so highly, from being cheapened by numbers. Besides, they think it would be hard to find many men qualified for a dignity for which merely ordinary virtues are not sufficient. Their priests are esteemed no less highly abroad than at home, which can be seen from the following fact. Whenever their armies join in battle, the Utopian priests are to be found, a little removed from the fray, but not far, wearing their sacred vestments and down on their knees. With hands raised to heaven, they pray first of all for peace, and then for victory to their own side, but without much bloodshed on either hand. Should their side be victorious, they rush among the combatants and restrain the rage of their own men against the enemy. If any of the enemies see these priests and call to them, it is enough to save their lives. To touch the robe of a priest will save all their property from confiscation. This custom has brought them such veneration among all peoples, and given them such genuine authority, that they have saved the Utopians from the rage of the enemy as often as they have protected the enemy from the Utopians. Instances of this are well known. Sometimes, when the Utopian line has buckled, when the field was lost, and the enemy was rushing in to kill and plunder, the priests have intervened, separated the armies, and concluded an equitable peace. There was never anywhere a tribe so fierce, cruel, and barbarous as to not hold their persons sacrosanct and inviolable. The Utopians celebrate the first and last days of every month, and likewise of each year, as holy days. They divide the year into months, which they measure by the orbit of the moon, just as they measure the year itself by the course of the sun. In their language, the first days are known as the Cynomerns, and the last days as the Trapemerns, which is to say, first feasts and last feasts. Their churches are beautifully constructed, finely adorned, and large enough to hold a great many people. This is a necessity, since churches are so few. Their interiors are all rather dark, not from architectural ignorance, but from deliberate policy. For the priests think that in bright light the congregation's thoughts will go wandering, whereas a dim light tends to concentrate the mind and encourage devotion. Though there are various religions in Utopia, as I have said, all of them, even the most diverse, agree in the main point, which is worship of the divine nature. They are like travelers going to one destination by different roads. So nothing is seen or heard in the churches that does not square with all the creeds. If any sect has a special rite of its own, that is celebrated in a private house. The public service is ordered by a ritual which in no way derogates from any of the private services. Therefore, in the churches, no image of the gods is to be seen, so that each person may be free to form his own image of God, after his heart's desire, in any shape he pleases. There is no special name for God, apart from the common word, Mithra. Whatever the nature of the divine majesty may be, they agree to refer to it by that single word, and their prayers are so phrased as to accommodate the beliefs of all the different sects. On the evening of the last feast, they meet in their churches. While still fasting, they thank God for their prosperity during that month or year which is just ending. Next day, which is first feast, they all flock to the churches in the morning to pray for prosperity and happiness in the month or year which is just beginning. On the day of last feast, in the home before they go to church, wives kneel before their husbands, and children before their parents, to confess their various failures and negligences, and beg forgiveness for their offenses. Thus, if any cloud of anger or resentment has arisen in the family, it is dispersed, and they can attend divine services with clear and untroubled minds. For they consider it sacrilege to worship with a rankling conscience. If they are conscious of hatred or anger toward anyone, they do not take part in divine services till they have been reconciled and have cleansed their hearts, for fear of some swift and terrible punishment. As they enter the church, they separate, men going to the right side and women to the left. Then they take their seat, so that the males of each household are placed in front of the head of that household, while the womenfolk are directly in front of the mother of the family. In this way, they ensure that everyone's behavior in public is supervised by the same person whose authority and discipline direct him at home. They take great care that the young are everywhere placed in the company of their elders. For if children were trusted to the care of other children, they might spend in childish foolery the time they should devote to developing a religious fear of the gods, which is the greatest and almost the only incitement to virtue. They do not slaughter animals in their sacrifices, and do not think that a merciful God, who gave life to all creatures, will be gratified with the shedding of blood. They light incense, scatter perfumes, and burn a great number of candles. Not that they think these practices profit the divine nature in any way, any more than human prayers do, but they like this harmless kind of worship. They feel that sweet smells, lights, and rituals elevate the mind and lift it with a livelier devotion towards the adoration of God. When they go to church, the people all wear white. The priest wears a robe of many colors, wonderful for its workmanship and decoration, though not of materials as costly as one would suppose. It has no gold embroidery, nor any precious stones, but it is decorated with the feathers of different birds so skillfully woven together that the value of the handiwork far exceeds the cost of the most precious materials. They add that certain symbolic materials are hidden in the patterning of the feathers on the robes, the meaning of which is carefully handed down among the priests. These messages serve to remind them of God's benefits toward them, and consequently of the gratitude they owe to God, as well as of their duty to one another. As the priest in his robes appears from the vestibule, the people all fall to the ground in reverence. The stillness is so complete that the scene strikes one with awe, as if a divinity were actually present. After remaining in this posture for some time, they rise at a word from the priest. They then sing hymns to the accompaniment of musical instruments, most of them quite different in shape from those in our part of the world. Many of them produce sweeter tones than ours, but others are not even comparable. In one respect, however, they are beyond doubt far ahead of us, because all their music, both vocal and instrumental, renders and expresses natural feelings, and perfectly matches the sound to the subject. Whether the words of the hymn are cheerful, supplicatory, troubled, mournful, or angry, the music represents meaning through the melody so admirably that it penetrates and inspires the minds of the ardent hearers. Finally, the priest and the people together recite certain fixed forms of prayer, so composed that what they all repeat in unison each individual can apply to himself. In these prayers, the worshippers acknowledge God to be the great creator and ruler of the universe, and the author of all good things. They thank God for benefits received, and particularly for the divine favor which placed them in the happiest of commonwealths, and inspired them with religious ideas which they hope are the truest. If they are wrong in this, and if there is some sort of society or religion more acceptable to God, they pray that he will, in his goodness, reveal it to them, for they are ready to follow wherever he leads them. But if their form of society is the best, and their religion the truest, then they pray that God will keep them steadfast, and bring other mortals to the same way of life, and the same religious faith. Unless, indeed, there is something in this variety of religions which delights his inscrutable will. Then they pray that after an easy death God will receive each of them to himself. How soon or how late it is, not for them to say. But if God's divine majesty so please, they ask to be brought to him soon, even by the hardest possible death, rather than be kept away from him longer, even by the most prosperous of earthly careers. When this prayer has been said, they prostrate themselves on the ground again. Then, after a little while, they rise and go to lunch. The rest of the day they pass in games and military training. Now I have described to you as accurately as I could the structure of that commonwealth, which I consider not only the best, but indeed the only one that can rightfully claim that name. In other places men talk very liberally of the commonwealth, but what they mean is simply their own wealth. In Utopia, where there is no private business, every man zealously pursues the public business, and in both places people are right to act as they do so. For among us, even though the commonwealth may flourish, there are very few who do not know that unless they make separate provision for themselves, they may perfectly well die of hunger. Bitter necessity, then, forces them to look out for themselves rather than for others, that is, for the people. But in Utopia, where everything belongs to everybody, no one need fear that. So long as the public warehouses are filled, anyone will ever lack for anything he needs. For the distribution of goods is not greedy. In Utopia, no one is poor. There are no beggars, and though no one owns anything, everyone is rich. For what can be greater riches than to live joyfully and peacefully, free from all anxieties, and without worry about making a living? No man is bothered by his wife's querulous complaints about money. No man fears poverty for his son, or struggles to scrape up a dowry for his daughter. Everyone can feel secure of his own livelihood and happiness, and of his whole family's as well. Wife, sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, great-great-grandsons, and the whole long line of descendants that gentlefolk are so fond of contemplating. Indeed, even those who once worked, but can no longer do so, are cared for just as well as if they were still productive. Now here I'd like to see anyone try to compare this justice of the Utopians with the so-called justice that prevails among other peoples, among whom, let me perish if I can discover the slightest scrap of justice or fairness. What kind of justice is it when a nobleman or goldsmith or a moneylender or someone else who makes his living by doing either nothing at all or something completely useless to the public gets to live a life of luxury and grandeur? In the meantime, a laborer, a carter, a carpenter, or a farmer works so hard and so constantly that even a beast of burden would perish under the load. Although this work of theirs is so necessary that no commonwealth could survive a year without it, they earn so meager a living and lead such miserable lives that a beast of burden would really seem to be better off. Beasts do not have to work every minute, and their food is not much worse. In fact, they like it better. And besides, they do not have to worry about their future. But workingmen not only have to sweat and suffer without present reward, but agonize over the prospect of a penniless old age. Their daily wage is inadequate even for their present needs, so there is no possible chance of their saving toward the future. Now, isn't this an unjust and ungrateful commonwealth? It lavishes rich rewards on so-called gentry, goldsmiths, and the rest of that crew, who do not work at all, or are mere parasites, purveyors of empty pleasures. And yet it makes no provision whatever for the welfare of farmers and colliers, laborers, carters, and carpenters, without whom the commonwealth would simply cease to exist. After society has taken the labor of their best years, when they are worn out by age and sickness and utter destitution, then the thankless commonwealth, forgetting all their pains and services, throws them out to die a miserable death. What is worse, the rich constantly try to grind out of the poor part of their meager wages, not only by private swindling, but by public laws. It is basically unjust that people who deserve most from the Commonwealth should receive least. But now they have distorted and debased the right even further by giving their extortion the color of law, and thus they have palmed injustice off as legal. When I run over in my mind the various commonwealths flourishing today, so help me God, I can see in them nothing but a conspiracy of the rich, who are fattening up their own interests under the name and title of the Commonwealth. They invent ways and means to hang on to whatever they have acquired by sharp practice, and then they scheme to oppress the poor by buying up their toil and labor as cheaply as possible. These devices become law as soon as the rich, speaking for the Commonwealth, which, of course, includes the poor as well, say they must be observed. And yet, when these insatiably greedy and evil men have divided among themselves goods which would have sufficed for the entire people, how far they remain from the happiness of the Utopians, who have abolished not only money, but with it greed. What a mass of trouble was uprooted by that one step! What a multitude of crimes was pulled up by the roots! Everyone knows that if money were abolished, fraud, theft, robbery, quarrels, brawls, seditions, murders, treasons, poisonings, and a whole set of crimes, which are avenged, but not prevented by the hangman, would at once die out. If money disappeared, so would fear, anxiety, worry, toil, and sleepless nights. Even poverty, which seems to need money more than anything else for its relief, would vanish if money were entirely done away with. Consider, if you will, this example. Take a barren year of failed harvests, when many thousands of people have been carried off by famine. If at the end of the scarcity the barns of the rich were searched, I dare say positively that enough grain would be found in them to have saved the lives of all those whom died from starvation and disease, if it had been divided equally among them. Nobody really need have suffered from a bad harvest at all. So easily might people get the necessities of life if that cursed money, which is supposed to provide access to them, were not in fact the chief barrier to our getting what we need to live. Even the rich, I'm sure, understand this. They must know that it's better to have enough of what we really need than an abundance of superfluities. Much better to escape from our many present troubles than to be burdened with great masses of wealth. And in fact, I have no doubt that every man's perception of where his true interest lies, along with the authority of Christ our Savior, whose wisdom could not fail to recognize the best, and whose goodness would not fail to counsel it, would long ago have brought the whole world to adopt utopian laws, if it were not for one single monster, the prime plague and begetter of all others. I mean pride. Pride measures her advantages not by what she has, but by what other people lack. Pride would not condescend even to be made a goddess, if there were no wretches for her to sneer at and domineer over. Her good fortune is dazzling only by contrast with the miseries of others. Her riches are valuable only as they torment and tantalize the poverty of others. Pride is a serpent from hell which twines itself around the hearts of men, and it acts like the suckfish in holding them back from choosing a better way of life. Pride is too deeply fixed in human nature to be easily plucked out. So I am glad that the Utopians at least have been lucky enough to achieve this commonwealth, which I wish all mankind would imitate. The institutions they have adopted have made their community most happy, and as far as anyone can tell, capable of lasting forever. Now that they have rooted up the seeds of ambition and faction at home, along with most other vices, they are in no danger from internal strife, which alone has been the ruin of many cities that seemed secure. As long as they preserve harmony at home, and keep their institutions healthy, the Utopians can never be overcome or even shaken by the envious princes of neighboring countries, who have often attempted their ruin, but always in vain. When Raphael had finished his story, I was left thinking that not a few of the customs and laws he had described as existing among the Utopians were quite absurd. Their methods of waging war, their religious practices, and their social customs were some of these, but my chief objection was to the basis of their whole system, that is, their communal living and their moneyless economy. This one thing alone takes away all the nobility, magnificence, splendor, and majesty which, in the popular view, are the true ornaments of any commonwealth. But I saw Raphael was tired with talking, and I was not sure he could take contradiction in these matters, particularly when I remembered what he had said about certain people who were afraid that they might not appear wise unless they found out something to criticize in the ideas of others. So with praise for the Utopian way of life and his account of it, I took him by the hand and led him into supper. But first I said that we would find some other time for thinking of these matters more deeply, and for talking them over in more detail, and I still hope such an opportunity will present itself some day. Meanwhile, though he is a man of unquestioned learning and highly experienced in the ways of the world, I cannot agree with everything he said. Yet I freely confess there are many things in the Commonwealth of Utopia that in our societies I would wish rather than expect to see. The end of the afternoon discourse of Raphael Hythloday on the laws and customs of the island of Utopia, hitherto known to but few, as reported by the most distinguished and learned man, Mr. Thomas More, citizen and under-sheriff of London. Thomas More to his friend, Peter Giles, warmest greetings. My dear Peter, I was absolutely delighted with the opinion of that sharp man whom you know. He posed this dilemma about my Utopia. If the story is put forward as true, he said, then I see a number of absurdities in it. But if it's a fable, then it seems to me that in various respects More's usual good judgment is at fault. I suspect this fellow of being learned, and I see that he's a friend. But whoever he is, my dear Peter, I'm much obliged to him. By this frank opinion of his, he has pleased me more than anyone since the book was published. For in the first place, either out of devotion to me or interest in the subject itself, he seems to have borne up under the burden of reading the book all the way through, and that not perfunctorily or hastily, the way priests read the divine office, those, at least, who read it at all. No, he read slowly and attentively, noting all the particular points. Then, having singled out certain matters for criticism, and not very many, as a matter of fact, he gives careful and considered approval to the rest. And finally, in the very expressions he uses to criticize me, he implies higher praises than some of those who have put all their energies into compliment. It is easy to see what a high opinion he has of me when he expresses disappointment over reading something imperfect or inexact, whereas I don't expect, in treating so many different matters, to be able to say more than a few things which are not totally ridiculous. Still, I'd like to be just as frank with him as he was with me, and in fact, I don't see why he should think himself so acute, so sharp-sighted, as the Greeks would say, just because he's discovered some absurdities in the institutions of Utopia, or caught me putting forward some half-baked ideas about the constitution of a republic. Aren't there any absurdities elsewhere in the world? And haven't most of the philosophers who've written about society, a ruler, or even the office of a private citizen managed to say something that needs correcting? But when he wonders whether Utopia is true or a fiction, then I find his judgment, in turn, sorely at fault. It is perfectly possible that if I decided to write about a commonwealth, and a fable of this sort had occurred to me, I would have spread a little fiction, like so much honey, over the truth, to make it more acceptable. But I would certainly have tempered the fiction so that, while it deceived the common folk, I gave hints to the more learned, which would enable them to see what I was about. So, if I'd done nothing but give special names to the governor, the river, the city, and the island, which hinted to the learned that the island was nowhere, the city a phantom, the river waterless, and that the governor had no people, that would not have been hard to do, and would have been far more clever than what I actually did. Unless I had a historian's devotion to fact, I am not so stupid as to have used those barbarous and senseless names of Utopia, Ander, Amarant, and Ademus. Still, my dear Giles, I see some people are so suspicious that what we naive fellows have written down of Hythlodae's account can hardly find any credence at all with those circumspect and sagacious persons. I'm afraid my personal reputation, as well as my authority as a historian, may be threatened by their skepticism. So it's a good thing that I can defend myself by saying, as Terence's Mysis said about Glycerim's boy, to confirm his legitimacy. Praise be to God, there were some free women present at his birth. And so it was a good thing for me that Raphael told his story not just to you and me, but to a great many perfectly respectable and serious-minded men. Whether he told them more things, and more important things, I don't know. But I'm sure he told them no fewer and no less important things than he told us. Well, if these doubters won't believe such witnesses, let them consult Hythlodae himself, for he is not yet dead. I heard only recently from some travelers coming out of Portugal that on the 1st of last March he was as healthy and vigorous a man as he ever was. Let them get the truth from him, dig it out of him with questions if they want. I only want them to understand that I'm responsible for my own work and my own work alone, not for anyone else's credibility. Farewell, my dearest Peter, to you and your lovely wife, and your delightful little girl. To all, my wife sends her very best wishes. And that is the end of Thomas More's Utopia. We will be visiting some other dystopian societies in the coming months, but in the meantime, you can follow me on any of these social media platforms, including over on Patreon. Patrons get extra bonuses like their name in the credits, videos a week early, and more. This has been Classical Titerature. Thanks for watching.